Seth Stern, co-author of Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion.
And Steve Wermiel, the other co-author of Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion.
Sure. It seems incredible today in an era of such focus on the ideology of Supreme Court nominees that really wasn't a consideration for the Eisenhower administration. The seat opened up in September of 1956 at a time where President Eisenhower was about to face a re-election campaign against Adlai Stevenson, who he had beaten handily in 1952. Things were a little closer than expected that September. And there was certainly an appeal of picking a Catholic justice. There hadn't been one on the court in about 7 years since the death of Frank Murphy. President Eisenhower laid out some specific criteria. In addition to a Catholic, he was hoping for a Democrat, someone with lower court judicial experience. He felt too many of the Truman picks had been sort of political cronies without experience as judges. And he also wanted someone who was relatively young. And when you combined all of those criteria, there weren't many candidates around the country. And William Brennan had spoken at a Justice Department conference that spring, and he had come to the attention of the Attorney General, Herbert Brownell. And so when the vacancy opened and these criteria were laid out by the President, Brennan quickly became a very appealing candidate.
I don't think he took part in the search, but he made the criteria and what he hoped to accomplish with the nomination very clear to his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, who was the main player. Interestingly, if I understand correctly, there wasn't a White House counsel's office in those days, so the Justice Department was the focal point. And I think once having made the things he was looking for clear, I don't think Eisenhower was a day-to-day hands-on participant in the process. But he did then meet with Brennan at the very last stage of the process.
To offer him the job, in essence.
Offer him the job. I mean, just as an interesting aside, because I always get a kick out of this, we made a big deal out of the Nixon secret recording system in the White House during Watergate, but we know a lot about the Brennan nomination because Eisenhower had his secretary pick up the extension phone and take dictation. She would write down shorthand verbatim accounts of many of the president's conversations. That didn't seem to cause a scandal ever in the way the Watergate recordings did, but so there's a lot of detail about what Eisenhower said to different people when he found out he had this Supreme Court vacancy.
There were two issues that came up at his confirmation hearing. One was his being a Catholic. He was forced to answer the question of whether he could balance his duty to the Constitution with his faith, and he pledged to. He was angry that he had to answer the question, and it was something that would continue to come up throughout his tenure, and he'd get more and more angry in his interviews with Steve when Steve would ask him in the course of their interviews, and Brennan would say, "Damn it, I've had to answer that. I've already answered it." The other issue that came up was he had made in two speeches prior to joining the U.S. Supreme Court when he was a judge in New Jersey, he had made some veiled criticism of Joseph McCarthy and his tactics, his anti-communist tactics, and McCarthy got permission to sit with the committee, question Brennan, and ultimately was the only vote heard on the Senate floor during a voice vote, voting no against him.
I think there was a little bit of suspense because when it started, nobody was sure what McCarthy's plan was, whether he was going to actually try to hold up the nomination, but it really kind of fizzled after one day of questioning. Well, he actually was a recess appointment, which is another interesting sidelight, something that it's unimaginable what happened with the Supreme Court nomination today. So he was appointed to the court in October 56, and then his confirmation hearings weren't until early spring the following year, 57. Once the confirmation hearing started, there was just a day and a half, not even a half of the second day, and then I think the vote was a couple of days later, and it was all over pretty quickly.
It would be unfamiliar to a modern viewer. There was no television. They were sort of crammed into a hearing room. We saw the newsreel footage of it. And yes, there was none of the trappings of the preparation, the murder boards. There was no real White House involvement. It was really done by the Attorney General, his deputy William Rogers, a couple other aides. The Attorney General said he had read through all of Brennan's opinions, something unimaginable today when you have teams of lawyers vetting everything. It was really a small group involved in the process.
Well, I think that's a harder question. I mean, the obvious answer would seem to be no, because of the politicization of the process today. I think it's a harder question than it might seem, because Brennan in 1956 was not the Brennan we know looking back from 34 years of service on the Supreme Court. He'd written a handful of important and kind of interesting, revealing, dissenting opinions on the New Jersey Supreme Court, but for the most part, his politics, his judicial philosophy were all kind of unknown. So Brennan might, in today's terms, Brennan might seem like a sort of centrist, relatively unknown, not particularly controversial nominee. In that context, he might make it today. In the context of the Brennan, if you get to the end of the book and think about who Brennan is, I don't think there's any chance he would make it.